Analysis of the budget. Now it's October the 31st today, and I really want to make a Halloween joke, but actually there's nothing terrifying at all about this lovely panel in front of me. The only scary thing today is the size of the bags under my eyes, and I got more sleep than James here. So we'll move on to the serious stuff. First Labour budget in 15 years, and many of the Resolution Foundation team were up either into the wee hours or even from the wee hours analysing this budget, crunching the numbers, producing a document that was so big it's broken the Resolution Foundation printers, which is why none of you have it in your hands, but hopefully we will be sorting that out and we'll have copies available for you when you leave the room. Those of you online, of course, can go straight to the website and download it now and read it now if you want to, but we'll get that sorted by the time you leave. It was a big effort from all of us because it was a really big budget. What we're going to do today is hear exactly what was in it and what do our panel make of it. You're going to hear first of all from our research director, James Smith, who will walk you through the main things that were in the budget, and then we'll have a response from the rest of our panel. We have Richard Hughes, Chair of the Office of Budget Responsibility for the last 4 years. Before that, he spent some time at the Treasury and the IMF. And then Gemma Tetlow, who's Chief Economist at the Institute for Government, where she leads their work on public finances. Those of you online can go to Slido and send questions to our panel. Use the hashtag budget. Those of you in the room, you can do the same if you like, but if you're trying to cut down on your screen time, we'll have some roving mics and you can ask questions in person. We'll also do a poll at some point, which you'll also have to go to Slido for that. So I think that's everything I need to say. Over to James. James, what did you hear yesterday?
All right, thank you, Mike, and thank you all for joining us this morning. So Mike says I'm going to walk you through the budget. I think it's going to be at least a light jog. There's quite a lot here, and I'd commend you to the main document. So you'll get a summary here, but I'd look at the main document that we put out. Lots of work from RF colleagues right through the night, looking fairly bleary-eyed this morning, those who've actually turned up. You can get all the details in there. Now, as Mike says, we rise above RF. At RF, we rise above the Halloween gimmicks. You don't get those here. We're very serious people. But if there's one word that you should associate with this budget, it's more. So here's Rachel. Here is the red box. And what we heard yesterday was that we're getting more spending. There we go. We're getting more taxes. A lot of people focusing on that. And we're getting more borrowing. So this red box is genuinely a huge one, given the size of the event that we saw yesterday. So let me take you through each of those three big bits of the budget. And I'm going to start with day-to-day spending, where I think there was the biggest change from the Chancellor, the really big choice to put more money into day-to-day public service spending. And the key reason she had to do that was the plans that she inherited from Jeremy Hunt featured really big cuts to those unprotected departments beyond health, education, defence, where there is some spending protection already in there. So what the Chancellor has basically done is put day-to-day spending on a much more realistic, much firmer footing, but that has been a massive effort. So this chart really shows you the increase in day-to-day public service spending in the final year of the forecast. That's about 44 billion here, and if you try and compare that to previous fiscal events, it's a surprisingly hard exercise, but at RF we go the extra mile. And you can see it's the largest event in terms of increases in that particular measure of spending over the lifetime of the OBR. But if you look back, we think it's the biggest increase in spending since Gordon Brown was Chancellor back at the spending review in 2002. So a really, really big event. That's very clear. And I guess a key part of all this is just how that event has translated into outcomes for different departments. Now, complicated chart, lots going on here. The thing to focus on is the pink bars here. So that shows you the increase in spending at the start of the forecast period. So this current year and next year. What you're basically seeing is a front-loaded increase in this day-to-day spending. And across departments, you can see some departments have done very well, a big increase for DWP, a big increase notably for Justice, which has been one of those really suffering departments. But still, some departments doing very badly. I don't know what the government has got against DCMS, but apparently they are going to be clobbered at the start of this forecast period again. But the key takeaway, I think, from this is that there's a very clear prioritisation of health spending as part of this mini spending review that we got. So we got an increase of around 35 billion across these 2 years in day-to-day spending. 40% of that is on health, and we've now got health spending accounting for roughly 42% of overall day-to-day spending, and that compares to about 30% just before the financial crisis. So we're increasingly becoming a health-dominated state, at least in terms of day-to-day spending. If you look beyond that very near-term picture, though, the big increases that you could see, focus on the blue line here, which is basically total day-to-day public service spending, RDEL, and we're doing this on a per-person basis here. And you can see that is rising very sharply in those dark blue lines for the first couple of years. But the dotted lines, where we just have an overall spending envelope, we're seeing growth of something like a 1.3% in the total envelope in real terms. And that's not far off the 1% that we had from Jeremy Hunt. So if you look at the outer years of this forecast, it's still very, very tight for government departments. If you focus in on the green unprotected departments that don't have any spending protections, there's still some cuts going on there, about 8 billion of cuts over the period from 25-26 to the end of the forecast period. So still very tight settlements. It's not going to be party time for those departments, and certainly we're going to see some pretty tight settlements for those vulnerable departments when we come on to the spending review, which is now apparently in late spring. So that's a kind of key piece of information for your diaries that we got yesterday. The other big piece of spending news, the big policy decision that we got, was on investment. And again, the Chancellor has basically cancelled the investment cuts that were in the previous plan. So the green bars here show you those March plans that were for freezes in nominal terms, cuts as a share of the economy in terms of overall investment. And you can see investment is now sort of sticking around 2.6, 2.7% of GDP. It's getting closer to the OECD average. It's still not there, but this is clearly a budget that put investment and getting investment back on track and turning the page on our dismal investment record really at the heart of the overall package for policy. Now, what you can see in this line here is the effect that this is having on growth. So we spent 100 billion in this forecast on extra investment. What Richard is giving you for that is 0.14% of GDP, but he's much more generous in the long run. So this effect builds over time because it takes time for public investment to be rolled out apart from anything, and it builds to about 1.4% of GDP. So this will eventually pay for itself, this policy. It will drive faster growth. It will just take time for that to happen, and that's certainly something that's inconvenient for the electoral cycle. So that's a risk here in terms of what the new government have done. That's it on spending. So if I turn to what you've been hearing all about in terms of taxes, and just give you a quick overview on what is going on with that. Again, this is big. This is big, people. This is the thing to have in mind. This has been a really big event. So if you look at this purple bar, that shows you the increase of 41 billion that we've got here in terms of tax rises by the end of the forecast period. And if you compare it to previous fiscal events, so those previous actual official fiscal events are in the dark red bars here, we think this is the biggest tax raising budget on record. So it's certainly a very big event, pretty close to Norman Lamont in 1992, but very, very big. These light pink bars just remind you of a certain incident around September 2002 where there was some quite big tax changes, but we shall gloss over that. I should remind you that the UK in pure tax take terms is now heading off to an all-time high, so a very big rise in the tax take was already very high, is now firmly the highest on record. And we're pulling away from those sort of Anglosphere countries, Canada, New Zealand, certainly above the US, and moving towards European levels of taxation here. So we've got a bigger state through day-to-day spending and capital spending, and we've got a bigger tax state as a result of what's happened yesterday. Now, big focus on increasing taxes through employer national insurance. So we've been hearing a lot about that change, and that's really, at least in scorecard terms, accounting for about 25 billion of that increase of around 40 billion. So a really big part of it. And what we got yesterday was not only an increase in the rate of employer national insurance, but also a cut in the threshold. And the combination of those two things basically means that the tax here, which is a tax on jobs, is very, at least in proportional terms, is focused on low-paying jobs, because that threshold really has a big impact. So for someone on about 9K, it's increasing costs for employers by £600. On 30K, it's more like 900. So you get a proportionally larger hit at the bottom here. This will definitely show up in wages. This is definitely a tax on working people. Let's be very clear about that. Even if it doesn't show up in pay packets from day one, it will eventually feed through to lower wages. So this is clearly, as I say, a tax on working people. But as well as hitting low-paid jobs, it also creates incentives for self-employment. This chart just shows what's going on in terms of somebody on £50,000 of earned income, what the difference in the tax system is if you're self-employed or you're a company owner, manager. And you can see that for employees pay much more by way of tax on that same amount. And you can decrease your tax liability very significantly by becoming self-employed. So this takes people out of the employee system, it takes them away from employment protections, it takes them out of the pension system in a lot of cases. So, this is distorting people's decisions in the labour market. So, very clear that the Chancellor had to raise taxes, had to raise money in order to invest and help with those public services, but this is doing it in a way that has created some new problems in the tax system that weren't there before. And that's really the result of these manifesto commitments not to just reverse the employer national insurance decreases that we saw under Jeremy Hunt. I won't say much else about changes to taxes. There have been some very welcome changes from our perspective to the capital gains tax system, the inheritance tax system. I'm sure we get more into that with Richard and Gemma. The other thing I would highlight here is the leaving of the fuel duty freeze in place for another year. I would describe the groan in the RF offices when that was announced as audible. Particularly odd given the very low level of petrol prices at the moment. So not fans of that, to be honest. Where does that leave living standards? So this chart shows you one of our famous distributional analyses of what's going on in this budget. And what we've done here is put personal tax changes and some small changes to the welfare system on one distributional chart. I should emphasize this excludes inheritance tax and capital gains tax, which will be focused on the top end here, but which are very difficult for us to model accurately. And you can see in this black line that the impact of higher taxes is really pretty proportional across the tax system, but in cash terms, which is the bars, is very concentrated at the top. What do these tax rises do to overall living standards? Well, this chart just shows you real household disposable income per person. So this is a measure of average living standards. And you can see in the black line that actually we've had some pretty good news on income, which has partly reflected what's been happening with interest rates and investment income over the past few quarters. But if you look at the red dotted line, we're now back to a very sort of weak looking forecast for living standards increases, particularly as those tax increases really hit living standards and income. So growth in this forecast is stronger than the previous parliament, which was the weakest parliament on record, but we think it's the weakest for a Labour government since 1955. So a really weak set of living standards issues in this OBR forecast. So if we turn to borrowing just briefly, so lots of discussion of fiscal rules, of commitments on all that. And let me show you why we've been talking about all that. So if you look, this chart shows the debt measure that Jeremy Hunt was targeting at the March budget. And if you take out those really big increases in investment, which is what we've done in the yellow line here, you've got a path for debt which is pretty flat and falling only very slightly at the end of the forecast. So there would have been about 6 billion in headroom, even if the Chancellor wanted to max out her space against this rule in order to invest. There was very little room. So really, if the Chancellor wanted to do something on investment, which was clearly a big priority yesterday, she needed to do that by changing the fiscal rules. And what we got was really a bold, creative change, I think, to the fiscal rules, and a move to what we're calling a per snuffle target. So that's the purple line here. I'm not sure that's going to become a household word, but that's the measure that we're now targeting. But the thing I would really emphasize here is there has been a really big increase in borrowing here. So it might not look huge on this chart, but the dotted line has now moved up so that per snuffle, so our net financial liabilities are pretty flat as a share of the economy. And the flip side of that is that debt in this red line here is going up. So there's something like 150 billion more borrowing here. Debt to GDP is going up by about 4 percentage points as a result of that. And that's really a big change. We saw some reaction to that in the markets yesterday with rates on gilts increasing, but this is certainly not a free lunch changing the fiscal rules. So we're now more exposed to movements in interest rates. We're more exposed to changes in sentiment in the debt market. So this change is bold. It has helped the Chancellor really turn the corner on what's going on in investment. That's very important from a growth perspective. But really, this also comes with those extra risks associated with higher debt. That's my whistle-stop tour of what was in yesterday's budget. Let me leave you with my key takeaways. Big, historic budget for all sorts of reasons. Bold action on spending. Inevitably, tax increases, where the manifesto commitments really meant that this was a more complicated task than it needed to be. And we now have a really big increase in borrowing and debt. And because you're at the Resolution Foundation, that weak living standards picture really makes clear the challenges ahead for this Labour government. That's all from me.
Thank you very much, James. James, we're pleased to know that a question about why fuel tax hasn't gone up is currently the most liked question on Slido, which just shows what a bunch of metropolitan elites you all are. Richard, I mean, all our work's in one night, but you guys have been working for weeks or months on this, so I'm sure you're relaxing now too. What's your take on all this?
So James is right that this was a very big budget, and really in all of its components. I think in the OBR, in trying to sum it up, we called it a 2-1-1 budget, which was 2% of GDP on spending, 1% of GDP on tax, and 1% of GDP on borrowing. So, and I guess just unpacking those a little bit and getting a bit under the numbers that James showed you in his presentation, spending up by 70 billion, about 2% of the economy. It's remarkable how much of that is front-loaded, as James pointed out, and the Treasury and the government was doing a spending review in the course of also putting the budget together. And so the areas where the government has detailed departmental spending plans, there's quite strong growth in public spending. That's this year and next. Resource budgets are growing by about 4.5% in real terms this year, 3% in real terms next year. And that supports a set of detailed departmental spending plans which have been negotiated and nailed down over the course of the last few weeks. What's notable is that the path of public spending then slows quite dramatically after that, back down to 1.3% over the remaining years of the Parliament after next year. That's not much above what was in the previous government spending plans, which were growing at about 1%. So I think on the spending side, clearly a big injection of resources into the health service and other public services over the next few years. But then still quite a lot of unanswered questions about what happens over the rest of the Parliament. And in particular, in light of the fact that you've got a spending envelope which is growing more slowly than the economy, but you've got a commitment to grow spending more quickly than the economy in a whole bunch of areas. I mean, in the NHS budgets haven't grown on average less than the economy in a very long time. We've got an aging society and lots of pressures on them. So there's a question about what happens to the health service budget after next year. You've got a commitment to increase defence spending as a share of GDP at some point when it can be afforded. And there's a question mark around the government says it's doing a strategic defence review. A question mark about what happens with the defence budget over the remainder of the Parliament and how you can fit that within an envelope which is falling as a share of GDP. Also commitments to get overseas aid back up to where it used to be at 0.7, which would also require the overseas aid budget to grow faster than the rest of the economy. So I think this has filled in, I think, some of the details on what the government spending plans are. They've proved pretty expensive over the next few years, and I think a big question about how they make all those numbers add up. Being the big question for the multi-year spending round due to be completed next summer. But nonetheless, a big injection of extra public spending into the system and a higher envelope for all those negotiations to happen. Half of that gets paid for by a very big increase in taxes. And about half of that extra 1% of GDP comes from the rise in employer national insurance contributions. NICS is a pretty reliable tax. If you tax payroll, you'll get the money. There's obviously a debate and question about how much of that gets passed on, like who ultimately pays that tax. We think in the long run, about 3/4 of it ends up reducing the real wages of workers rather than being borne by the employer, reducing them below where they would have ended up. And so ultimately, this is a tax which is falling on employees. Only about 1/4 of it reduces profits of the employers. But then, a decent chunk of the tax increase in our forecast is based on some pretty uncertain sources of revenue. It's taxes on assets, it's capital gains tax, inheritance tax, taxes on carried interest, taxes on other forms of assets where the yield is just inherently uncertain. We already assume big behavioural changes on the part of the target population to move their assets out of the country, to not take capital gains, so as to avoid having to pay the tax. And so a lot of uncertainty about whether all that tax yield ultimately gets delivered, and a big delta around our central forecast on that. So question marks around how much the tax ultimately comes in, and risks around everything that we've seen about the rise in the tax burden to pay for half of that increase in spending. You've then got a 1% increase in borrowing, which funds the rest of the big increase in the spending envelope, as James pointed out. The Chancellor does meet her new fiscal rules to get the current budget in balance and to get PSNUFL falling as a share of GDP by the end of the forecast. But she does so with very small margins, £10 billion on the current budget, £16 billion on net financial liabilities falling. That is a fraction of the risks that I've just highlighted around spending and tax, and so leaves very little headroom to deal with contingencies, uncertainties, things not turning out exactly as you might have hoped. And in the background, net debt, at least on one measure, which was the measure that the previous Chancellor was targeting, is rising in every year. And as a consequence of that, and the fact that interest rates in this country have remained stubbornly high and have been rising recently, you've got an interest bill which never falls below £100 billion in our forecast. And I think that's pretty much the first time ever we've had a forecast where debt interest costs on government never fell below 100 billion. And so, just because you're not targeting net debt doesn't mean it doesn't matter. You've still got to service the debt that you've got. And so that also, what happens to interest rates going forward is also a big risk and potential claim on that margin for risk that the Chancellor has set aside for herself. And so, I guess final question is, might growth come to the rescue and generate more tax revenues, which gives the Chancellor more breathing space to make that whole equation add up over the remainder of the Parliament? Well, we've actually got growth rising from about 1.1% this year to 2% next year. Quite a lot of that is a sort of temporary sugar rush you get from just a big fiscal stimulus coming out of this budget. The Chancellor's raised spending by a lot more than tax and is borrowing a lot more. That delivers a cash injection into an economy which is already pretty close to full capacity. And so you get a stimulus to demand, but pushes it above supply. That puts pressure on interest rates, both in the gilt markets, but also on the Bank of England to try and bring demand back into line with supply and bring inflation back to target. And so in that sense, it proves to be a temporary boost until interest rates and other crowding out effects bring the economy back into line with our view of potential growth, which is around 1.5, 1.75 by the time we get to the end of the forecast. And actually, by the medium term, this budget doesn't make a material difference to the level of potential output. If the government were to carry on investing into the future, as James said, we do think there's a long-term return on the extra investment that's going in, but it takes 8 to 10 years for that to actually turn net positive for growth, because the government's doing some other things this budget which are bad for growth. Right? They're putting taxes up on payrolls. That has an impact on employment. And they're also just borrowing more in the economy. That crowds out resources that would otherwise be available for businesses to use to invest. So that has offsetting negative effects on what the government is doing in public investment. And so, I guess to sum up, what does the future look like for future budgets for this Chancellor? Well, she's left herself not very much room for manoeuvre at the end of this budget. She's got some expensive spending commitments, which I think there are question marks about how they're going to be funded when she does a full multi-year spending review for the next Parliament. She's ruled out a bunch of tax rises, now including on corporation tax, and she's got all the ones that she ruled out in the manifesto, and is relying on a set of taxes which are pretty uncertain what the yield is going to be to deliver on the plans that she's got. And she's got 5 years left to get to her fiscal target, and a lot of uncertainty around them. So it is going to be an interesting few years.
Thank you very much, Richard. I'll just add one thing. I mean, often what all chancellors do is they kind of wait and see and cross their fingers. But that spending review that we talked about is coming up very, very soon, isn't it? It's not like she's got 2 or 3 years to wait for the finances to improve before she can distribute the largesse. It's like 5 or 6 months away, late spring. So not much time at all. Thanks very much. Gemma.
Great. So I'll try not to repeat things that James and Richard have already said. I mean, as both of them have said, this was a big budget in terms of tax spending and borrowing. It was clearly different from the letter of the Labour manifesto, which said that they would stick to previous government spending plans. But I think we have to say that that is just recognising a reality that was always going to have to be dealt with, that the previous government had set out spending plans that were not consistent with the sort of rhetoric around the desire for better public services that both parties went into the manifesto talking about. So I think this budget was finally recognising the reality that if we want better public services, then that means we're going to have to spend more on them than was in the previous plans. And sort of we finally got to that stage. It probably would have been better if we could have done that going into the election, but at least we now have some somewhat more plausible plans. Although I agree with James and Richard that there's a lot more money in the next couple of years, and then I think there is a question for the multi-year spending review next year of whether that's really enough to deliver on all the priorities. I think there was interesting things in the budget on growth. And it was great to see the OBR setting out sort of its 10-year assessment of how policies will affect growth, because I think that helps paint a more comprehensive picture of the choices and the policy impacts that we're likely to see. So, the picture on growth was that the tax rises are expected to drag on economic growth. Inevitably, it's hard to do a tax rise that doesn't have that effect, but that the focus on investment spending increases should, on the OBR's current best estimate, if that money is spent well, help to boost economic growth in the longer term, but that doesn't show up until the next Parliament. On sort of government strategy, I think we saw some more information about what this government's priorities and approach is going to be. On spending, there were clearly departments that did better and departments that did less well. James ran through those. From our side at the Institute of Government, we saw some important changes to the fiscal rules and wider fiscal framework. We're happy to go into those further in questions if anyone would like to hear my views on those. But I think there was there were various things that they changed that dealt with some of the problems that were in the previous fiscal framework, things like trying to move towards targeting measures of borrowing and debt 3 years out rather than 5 years out, so you don't have so much scope for penciling in nonsense, unlikely to happen policy changes in years 4 and 5 as a way of meeting your rules. Moving to a current budget balance target rather than overall borrowing target, so that you're more strict to yourself on day-to-day spending, but separate out borrowing for investment, that sort of thing. On tax, I think there was a mixture of some strategy and some lack of strategy. Maybe overall I'd go on sort of lack of a very clear direction on tax. They did set out their new corporate tax roadmap. That is a welcome sort of clarification on some of those things, and they set out some areas that they're planning to consult on for reform. But in other areas, I think perhaps some other strategy in the other capital measures, there was some overall sense of direction on trying to close down loopholes so that we treat people in similar circumstances more similarly, and fewer options for sort of changing your behaviour to avoid things. But otherwise, I think there was a bit of the big employer, Nick's rise, was clearly a constrained choice within the bounds of the constraints they put on themselves in the manifesto not to raise any of the major taxes. If you were trying to raise tens of billions from tax, the only way to do that was on one of the big taxes, so that was really pretty much the only option they had. And I think on other areas, it's not clear what their priorities are. I was also somewhat dismayed to hear the announcement on fuel duty for a government that says it wants to get to net zero, and was announcing significant tax raises in other places, including on other types of excise duties. The fact that they couldn't come out this time and make any sort of progress on increasing fuel duties, I think really does raise the question of when is that ever going to change, and should we really believe that those tax revenues are coming in future years? Looking ahead to the next election, I think in a sense they're making a big bet on public services doing better over the next few years, because in terms of some of their other missions, the boost to growth is going to take some time to come through, and as James said, the forecasts for household incomes show those being pretty stagnant through to the next election. So what are people going to see that feels better from this government? It may be quite a lot about how much improvement to public services can be delivered. And I think there are various risks left in these, which have already been touched on: the very, very low headroom against fiscal rules, the uncertainty about what we raise from capital taxes, and particularly the low RDEL plans for the next multi-year spending review. So we could be coming back to reassess the plan if some of those don't plan out in exactly the way planned.
Great, thank you very much, Gemma. And that last point reminded me of some of the discussion I've been hearing and reading about, are we back to austerity? That we've got into the habit of commentators of defining any real terms cut as austerity. But as Richard reminded us at the very end, the difference between the plans that Rachel Reeves set out yesterday and Jeremy Hunt's was that, yes, they both have weak growth in spending at the end of the period, which for some departments might be real cuts, but it's from a higher base. And what the Chancellor did yesterday was put in that extra money this year and next year, which then stays, just doesn't grow very much after that. So sometimes just thinking about the rate of change of spending isn't always the only metric to think about. Okay, that's fantastic. I'll come to the audience, I think, for some questions in a minute, but let me just start with the clarification question put online. You all liked our discussion of Persnuffle, but somebody has asked us if we could just explain what that change in the debt rule actually means. What is the new debt rule, and why does it give the Chancellor room to borrow more? Maybe James could start us off on that.
I want to hear Gemma's views on this, I've got to say.
Well, if you could start with explaining what the rule change is, or what the new definition is.
Yeah, so this public sector net financial liabilities, what it basically does is it nets off a wider range of assets from your official stock measure in the fiscal rules. So we're very used to thinking about net debt, so that nets off very liquid assets like the foreign exchange reserves in terms of the overall measure of debt that you're targeting. But what Persnuffle does is include less liquid financial assets. So the key is financial assets here. So if the government is doing anything that creates financial assets, and I think the most relevant thing in this space is basically what it's doing with the National Wealth Fund, GB Energy, which could very easily be driving investment, but financing it through those vehicles, creating big financial assets and liabilities, which in this measure would roughly offset. So any extra investment that was coming through those particular vehicles would be basically neutral in debt. So you could expand them, do more investment, and you wouldn't be using up your fiscal space against that rule. I have to say, what a lot of people have said is this is great because it essentially incentivizes investment. And that's not really true in this framework, because public investment will tend to create physical assets. Physical assets are not included in public sector net financial liabilities, and that just means that if you wanted to create more space, you would still be able to do that by cutting investment back if you wanted to do more day-to-day spending, for example. So that's basically, although I should emphasise the Chancellor also has a day-to-day spending rule, so that's an important channel on that. But so it's really important from that perspective. And then I suppose the other thing to have in mind on this is there's basically a sort of one-off gain here. So there's quite a lot of headroom against the Persnuffle target before measures, so something like 50 billion, and the Chancellor really used a very large amount of that headroom up, of that room up, leaving only about 16 billion of headroom. So that's where this big increase in borrowing has come. But roll forward, that won't be, those big increases in headroom, they won't be coming through again. So this won't be something that gives you lots more room time after time to do more investment. So it's not clear it will sustain more investment. Sorry, I've talked a lot about this.
Great, thank you. Richard, anything to add to that?
I think just to say two things. One is the kind of, James is exactly right that it only creates opportunities to invest in financial instruments, not investing in physical assets. And also, that narrows the scope of the kind of investments you can do quite a lot, because you can only invest in things which can earn you a financial return. And that means you can invest in a company that invests in windmills, because ultimately windmills generate electricity, sell it to the grid, and raise money from households and businesses. Hospitals, generally speaking, we've got a health services free at the point of use. So, lending money to people to build hospitals is not going to get you very much through a loan. And so it opens up, both opportunities but also risks for the public finances, in the sense that there are opportunities to pursue these kind of close to market investments, which the private sector isn't doing. And if government got involved, it could generate some returns for itself as well as some wider returns to the economy. The risks are the government does the borrowing, and it's definitely on the hook for the borrowing, because it's got to pay the interest rate on gilt unless it wants to default, and no government wants to do that. It then invests the money in a loan, but that loan is going to be uncertain. Loans to speculative, investments in infrastructure may generate the returns that you expect. It may not, and so its asset side is going to be riskier than its liabilities, which are a certainty. And from our perspective, as people forecasting public finances and the probabilities of meeting its fiscal targets, are going to have to take a much closer look at the performance of those assets over time to make sure that the net return is where it should be.
And you guys said you would do that, didn't you?
We did. And then we'll have a conversation about how many people we need to do it.
Oh, very cunning. Gemma, any thoughts on the new rules?
Yeah, I mean, on the debt rule, so the new target gets around some of the problems with the old target. So the public sector net debt, which we've targeted since 1997, one of its unattractive features is that it only captures the short-term financial assets, not long-term financial assets. So previously, if the government sold off things that were long-term financial assets, even if it sold it off for less than they were worth, that would look like it was improving the public sector debt position. So things like when we sold off the student loan book in 2017, there was a big incentive to do that, even if you weren't really genuinely improving your financial position. This gets round that, but as Richard said, it then moves to a different margin that creates potentially perverse incentives for government to invest in particular ways, because it would count versus not counting. I think our view at IFG is that there's no single perfect debt measure to target as a sort of proper comprehensive assessment of the government's fiscal sustainability position. There are some reasons you actually do care about public sector net debt, in terms of that's a much better capturing sort of actually how much cash have you borrowed from the market, how much more do you need to sort of raise over time, and sort of your actual ability, sort of your short-term assets. So it's things that you literally could sell tomorrow and use to pay off your creditors if really, really needed. So that does matter to an extent. But I think actually probably more important is the government looks at these measures more broadly, and I guess we would quite like the OBR to take more of a kind of broad picture qualitative judgment on looking across the board at different measures of indebtedness which have different pros and cons. Is the government behaving in a way that is consistent with fiscal sustainability in the longer term?
Great, thank you very much.
I like this person stayed anonymous, by the way. It's okay to be interested in fiscal. I think that's important. It's a safe space.
Okay, very good. I wanted to turn to growth next. I mean, in the election campaign, the Labour Party put a huge amount of emphasis on growth as its solution, both to public services, but also to living standards and household income. But on the face of it, we had a budget where Richard's colleagues say it's actually lowered the rate of growth 5 years out, despite borrowing all extra money to invest. So, where does that leave us? And I guess the other question I'd like to ask the panelists is, what do we learn from the budget about the government's growth strategy? James, I'll start with James.
Well, as I said just very briefly, what this budget really told us, so we had Rachel Reeves being very clear that she was going to target debt before the election, even just after the election. And what she's done is done a very big change to the fiscal rules. We've just discussed there are pros and cons to that. But what is clear is that that is something that is a big choice, and it's clearly telling us that this government is serious about turning the page on our record on investment, and it's serious about getting growth. So it's prepared to take some risk on that. And I think, you know, where we are on the new government is there's been some positive noises. So some of the housing measures that they've announced, for example, on the planning system, some of the things they seem to want to do on trade, industrial strategy, all those are in key areas where you would think of as driving some growth. But what we need now is to really see more meat on those policies and really get some action that takes us from here are some good things that we can do, here's some more public investment, to here's how we can actually move quickly to take steps to boost the supply side of the economy, because that is what's really needed after, you know, the 15 years where we've had the weakest growth since the Great Depression. So this is a really big problem facing the country, and we're seeing the start of an answer to it, but what we need is more on that.
Thank you. If we could throw the question around before I turn to Gemma. Gemma, your thoughts on this, but also, was there anything else that the government could have done could have announced in this budget, which might have made shift of a dial on growth?
Sure. I mean, I think I agree with James that the big thing here was a sort of betting on public investment as being a path to growth. I think it's welcome that they've talked about and started to lay out some details of sort of some guardrails, as they talk about, around public investment to try and provide more transparency and accountability to make sure the money is spent well. But I think we do need to see more detail of what that really means, because public investment isn't good in and of itself. It needs to be channeled and spent efficiently. I suppose the other thing on growth that was talked about, or there was lots of lobbying and briefing ahead of the budget, was the question of what will the changes to asset taxation do to growth and the incentives for entrepreneurship and investment in the UK. I'm afraid I haven't yet got my head around all the details of the costings that the OBR has put on these, but Richard may be able to say more. But there clearly has been quite a lot of work going on with OBR, Treasury and HMRC trying to understand this, and including recosting the sort of previously announced non-dom policies. But that will be one very big question of quite an interesting test of what really are the impacts of those sorts of changes and how do you mitigate potential costs. On other measures for growth, I think in some ways I think it's very welcome that the government hasn't rushed into trying to announce a full Parliament's worth of detailed spending plans. Those clearly will be important for affecting growth and supporting public services. I think it's good that they've actually given themselves till late spring next year, but that will be, I think, an important part of the picture.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's also a reasonable argument to make that it shouldn't be only the budget that sets out what the growth strategy is. I mean, the government will get growth through its industrial strategy, its skills strategy, its trade strategy, its employment strategy, and we know that all those things are ongoing. Yeah. You also described very, very clearly, both Gemma and Richard did, how the rise in employer national insurance is acting as a drag on growth. But there aren't really any ways of extracting £20 billion out of the economy without Richard and his colleagues saying, I'm sorry, that's going to slow down growth, are they? So I mean, it's difficult. It's not really the tax measures, it's not the particular tax measures themselves that are slowing down growth. It's just the move to, we need to put more in public services.
Yeah, and I think you have to take this in the round, because I suppose the thing that wasn't scored in Richard's numbers is what would actually happen to growth if we didn't fund key public services, and that's the sort of trade-off. So I think you do need to look at these things together.
Yeah, thanks, Richard.
It is certainly the case that the one thing that was positive for growth in our budget and that we did score on the supply side of our forecast was the additional public investment. It's important to say that that's additional public investment relative to the previous government plans, but all it does is actually keep public investment flat as a share of GDP compared to where it is now. So it stops it from falling rather than increases it as a share of GDP. But you know, even that provides a better outlook for potential output and the supply side of the economy in the long run. The issue is that the long run is very far off. The Chancellor's given herself a 5-year horizon to hit her fiscal rules. But you know, I live near the path of HS2, and at the moment it's just a very expensive hole in the ground. And one hopes that in the long run, when it's completed and you've got higher traffic between here and the north, that generates opportunities for additional businesses to operate and more economic activity. But those returns come 10, 20, 30 years down the line and take quite a long time to build up to their maximum impact. So you've got to feel a bit bad for chancellors who've got long-term ambitions for the country, but short-term deadlines to get the public finances sorted out.
These pesky matters of elections as well as fiscal rules. Thank you very much. Let's take a couple of questions from the audience, if that's okay. We'll start with the gentleman in front. We'll take three and then come to the panel. If you can say who you are.
Joel Hills from ITV News. I've got a couple of questions. I'll keep them very brief. First of all, in terms of the drag on growth that's coming from tax, Richard, had the Chancellor decided simply to reverse the tax cuts that Jeremy Hunt introduced, would that have been less of a drag on growth than increasing national insurance for businesses? And the second question is about the fiscal hole. I'm ever so sorry, but the government's pointed to this spending pressure of £22 billion, which it knew absolutely nothing about till it got into the Treasury. The OBR assessment is that it was about half that size, but that it did exist. Had Rachel Reeves gone into the Treasury in July and found that everything was pretty much as spelt out by the OBR in March, would we still have been talking about tax rises in this budget?
And then there was a gentleman at the back.
Thank you, and thanks to the presenters. My name is Mikey Hoare. I'm at comms advisory firm Keck CNC. A question about science and technology. Much of the UK science community was concerned about what this budget would mean for them. It looks at first blush in terms of DSIT's budget like perhaps those concerns are unfounded, but any steer on what we can learn from yesterday about the government's approach to investing in emerging technologies and science? Thanks.
One at the front. We'll let Gavin ask a question. Question from the home team. Not planted, I promise you.
No, definitely not planted. A question mainly for Richard. Well done, by the way, for your efforts yesterday. So I think I'm right in saying that your underlying productivity assumption is still 1.25. And as you know, that's almost double what we've seen since 2010. And as you also know, as you set it out very well, all of your numbers are massively sensitive to that assumption, and there's a massive risk around it. You've been more optimistic than reality has borne out for quite a long time. How much longer has the economy got, and more importantly, has the Treasury got, before you decide that you are, after all, too optimistic and you're going to mark down the productivity assumption, which will play havoc with everything we've talked about so far today?
All right, thanks. We'll go to the panel with that one. So on the first question on should the government just have reversed the tax cuts introduced by Jeremy Hunt, we definitely thought a lot about that, and whether employer NI is just employee NI with a different name. James, do you want to just give us the highlights of what's in our report on that?
Oh my God, so many hours in a small room trying to think about this question. So I think one way of looking at what's happened here might be quite a dry way of looking at it, is we've sort of marched our way, not sort of to the bottom of the valley, not quite to the top of the hill in terms of national insurance by cutting national insurance on the employee side. And now we've marched our way back up again, to a broadly offsetting extent by raising employer national insurance. And what's the sort of net of those things? Well, the big winners are the self-employed, as I was talking about earlier. So you kind of gain from the NI employee cut, but you are not affected by the the employer bit of it. And if you're on very low incomes or very high incomes, then you've lost out basically, because at the low end you're hit by the threshold change, and because employer national insurance contributions are capped, it really affects right up the distribution. So that's the kind of way of thinking about these two. We've kind of gone on a round trip with some slightly odd incentives that have been created along the way.
Yeah. Richard, feel free to address any of the panels.
Yes, we have to be a bit careful because we are legally prohibited from considering alternative policies from those of the government, but we did assess Jeremy Hunt's tax cuts in our two previous forecasts, and we've obviously assessed Rachel Reeves's NIC's increase in this one. And I guess the important thing to distinguish is that, you know, changes in employee NIC's rates affect marginal incentives, whereas changes in employer rates affect average incentives. And so changes in the marginal rate affect labour supply decisions, whereas changes in the average rate tend to lead to changes in people's average wages. And so, you know, the Jeremy Hunt changes had quite a big impact on people's decisions to supply labour and the number of people employed. And you saw those impacts reflected in our forecast when Jeremy Hunt presented those measures. So you saw a boost to employment from increasing the marginal return to work. And so in that sense, you got a big employment boost. In the reforms that Rachel Reeves introduced in NICs and raising the NICs rate on employers, you know, that affects average incentives, and so as a result, more of it turns up in lower real wages rather than fewer people working. And so in that sense, you know, they both, you know, Rachel Reeves's tax changes raise a little bit more than Jeremy Hunt's tax cuts, but they have different effects on people's labour supply decisions. Jeremy's had a bigger hit on a bigger boost to numbers. Most of the economic impact of Rachel Reeves's changes have happened on salaries.
Thanks. Gemma, and then we'll come back to Richard on Gavin's question, I think. Well, any of those, but yeah, maybe start with the.
You can shoot black holes, Gemma.
I mean, on the NICs change, I would agree with James's point that this has one of the benefits of particularly the first NICs cut that Jeremy Hunt made was to reduce the wedge in tax between the lower rates for self-employed and the higher rates for employees, which encourages companies to engage with people through a self-employment route rather than employing them normally. And unfortunately, Rachel Reeves's move increases that wedge again, and obviously increases the wedge between the tax paid on employment versus people who can structure their income in other ways, such as company owner managers who can take their income as dividends and pay income tax rather than having to pay NICs. The other group I think are probably overall better off here are people on the minimum wage, where employers won't be able to cut their wages to try and claw back the NICs costs, whereas obviously changes on employees' NICs, which comes off after the headline pay, do benefit those people. So I think they may be protected, but I'm happy to be stand corrected from resolution if I've got my analysis wrong there. I'm happy to take the black hole question.
There you go. Yes.
Please do, Gemma, yeah.
I mean, on that, resolution, IFG, IFS, others were shouting as loud as we could before the election about the fact that the public service spending plans that were penciled in by the previous government were just not consistent with achieving the sort of public service improvements that both major parties were talking about. I think the revelations in July, there was some things there we were not fully aware of, I think particularly the asylum costs, but that does not explain why a big adjustment was needed to public spending plans and therefore taxes in this budget. I think we would always have faced a big question about how to square that circle.
Great, thanks. Richard, do you want to address Gavin's question about your optimism?
Yes, we're kind of above the median on productivity growth, and certainly in the medium term, we assume some significant recovery in productivity growth. Not to the levels that we've seen before the financial crisis, but certainly above the very dismal levels that we've seen since. And that represents what we think is a central view of where the UK economy is likely to end up, given its structural mix. A lot of the technological changes that we've seen in recent years, which are clearly making a difference in US productivity, are in the sorts of sectors where we have a decent amount of economic activity and also what appears to be a global comparative advantage and a growing export share. And those are professional services, technology, biomedical industries, and so in that sense, I think it would be too pessimistic to assume that we didn't see some kind of pickup in productivity in the UK economy as a whole from stronger performance in those sectors, some of which you already see coming through, especially in our export figures. So but not to something which we saw pre 2007, but something better than today. But it's something which we keep under review. And you're right. We look at this data every forecast and say, how is it looking compared to what we're assuming, and we'll see.
Do you look at look at the data and go, what can I tell from these data? So for people who are following this closely, a lot of our productivity data comes from the labour force survey. That's the employment measure. And at the moment, we're extremely uncertain about the actual level of employment to a massive first order degree. So the response rates of the LFS have been falling off a cliff. And if you look at admin data, it suggests as many as 1 million more people in employment. If there's anything like that number, our productivity record, which looks pretty stretched, as Gavin was saying, relative to that OBR assumption, it completely blows out of the water, and we've got a very weak productivity growth over the past few years. And that would really, I think, if that's the reality of the labour market, that would really call into question that productivity assumption.
Great, thanks. So I know some of you have got places to be, other briefings, so we'll make sure we finish at 10:15 promptly. But there's a question online from Steve about the distributional impact, which I know we've touched on, but it might be good also, as well as looking at the question, to also reflect on perhaps what we didn't hear in the government, particularly about measures on welfare or affecting those people in poverty. So the government, on the actual wording of the question Steve has put to us, that the Treasury did publish their own assessment of the distributional analysis of the budget, which shows it being remarkably progressive, so pro-poor and anti-rich, but very much driven by their inclusion of the extra public service spending. And which is not an unreasonable thing to do. It's something they've been doing actually for quite a long time now, it is the case that most public service spending is of more benefit to lower income households than it is to higher income households. So yes, it will be the case that if that extra public service spending is spent wisely, then it probably will be of more benefit to the lower half than the top half. But James, we looked at, you showed our analysis of the other measures, but also there are, as you said, there are some things affecting the very rich we left out, but also reflect more generally on what we didn't hear from the government in terms of poverty.
Yeah, on the benefit side, this was a fiscal event where it was more striking what wasn't talked about as part of the overall policy package. So, as we've talked about the Resolution Foundation for a long time, we have these twin problems of very weak growth, but also very high inequality. What that boils down to is, people on low incomes having high rates of poverty, really low levels of living standards relative to other countries. And the new government, to its credit, has said they would like to address that. They would like to improve living standards for all. And doing that really means addressing what's going on at the bottom of the income distribution. And if you think about, there was a piece that we put out in the run-up to the budget which really focused on what policies could shift the dial here, where, no surprise, there'll be removal of the 2-child limit, removal of the benefit cap, uprating local housing allowance to help people on lower incomes with very high housing costs. We didn't get any of that yesterday, and if this government really wants to make progress on living standards, those are the places to look first. So, like I say, the outlook for living standards still looks weak after this budget, and there are big challenges ahead for this government. That is for sure. Thanks.
Maybe Gemma, anything to say on this one? With poverty, we're still waiting for a strategy coming in the spring.
Yeah. I think in terms of what we heard yesterday on sort of living standards for the bottom of the distribution, actually a lot of store seemed to be put on efforts to get more people into work and to tackle inactivity. We didn't see any major welfare changes, for example. That, as you say, that's probably not the final answer because we're waiting for a poverty strategy, but much of what was done in the sort of DWP space yesterday was to say that we're going to put more resources into employment programs and trying to get more people into work as a way of tackling living standards rather than through the benefit system.
Yeah, there was more money for DWP through the Household Support Fund, extending it for a full year. But yeah, we have an employment strategy, employment white paper to come.
Yeah.
We have a child poverty strategy to come. So I think it feels very much, wait and see.
Yeah.
I mean, Richard's really big picture on living standards is fairly bleak, isn't it? It feels like a budget where the government has prioritised public services over living standards. Is that fair?
I guess on the narrow measure that is sort of household disposable income, there is a bit of growth over our forecast, about 0.5% on average per year, but pretty much no growth in the middle of the forecast. Yeah. So 2026, 2027, it slows to zero because you've got that next rise being passed on to people who are working, and then picks up toward the end. But I guess that is a narrow definition of living standards, which is just looking at pounds in people's pockets. They're also
quite an important measure.
It's an important measure, but what the government was trying to do was improve public services, which also matters for their quality of life.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. We'll do a poll, I think, just before we wrap up. It has been a big budget, but what our poll is trying to get at is, will any of us be thinking about this in years to come, or will we all have forgotten about it in a few weeks' time? So what do you think will people, what of what you heard in the budget do you think people will notice most by the end of the Parliament? You can go to slido.com, and the code is budget. Will it be the extra funds for the NHS? Will it be the £3 bus fares? Fewer potholes? Will we be lamenting the increase in government debt? A penny off your pint, which I'm sure you all appreciated at the two chairmen last night. It's made a big difference. Or will it be the weaker wage growth? And as Richard just mentioned, we haven't highlighted on that. There is the forecast for wage growth is particularly weak, and basically is down to zero in the middle year of the forecast. So it really feels like we've got a two years of a semi boom this year and next year, and then very bleak. So. You can get voting and ask the panel what they think will be most remembered from this budget. James?
I'm going to do a classic RF panelist move here by trolling the question that someone asked me if this was the right set of things. I personally feel like investment is the thing that is really going to stick in the mind. So the big sea change there. That for me is the really striking thing about this. I was sort of preparing myself for this to be a slightly disappointing fiscal event, let's say, with very limited capacity to actually do much on investment. And we have seen pretty significant change. I mean, as we've talked about, we're not talking about investing at crazy levels here, but this is definitely what a lot of people like me have been talking about for a long time, and bemoaning the cuts to investment that we've seen. So I think this is a really big change. If you want me to say one of these here, I think government debt is going to be something that we'll be talking about increasingly in the coming years. So that will stick around, unfortunately, I think.
Very good. Richard, are you going to reject the premise of the question as well? Or?
I am, and I'm going to go for. I can go for what can you hope for, and what should you worry about?
Yes,
I think we can hope for an improved NHS and fewer potholes, which I think the government is trying to do something about in this budget in both senses. In that they're putting a lot more money into NHS, and they are keeping investment going over the next 5 years. I think the thing to worry about is that the NHS doesn't improve by as much as we hope, and we've still got a lot of potholes out there. The one certainty is that if you spend money on those things through borrowing, you will have a lot more debt by the end, and you'll be paying for it. So, but we live in hope.
Very good. And Gemma, we were talking before the session started on risks, and maybe you could also touch on some of those as you answer this question. So, what might people remember by the end of the Parliament, but also what are the threats, what are the risks of this budget?
So I think I'd probably go with the same answers as Richard and James on what we'll notice. So I think more debt. I suspect this is something that the opposition Conservatives will want to keep focusing on. So it's probably going to keep being discussed. It does seem a lot of money is going into investment. Whether it's going to potholes, I don't know, but it's probably a politically savvy strategy, as well as I think being quite high up the Department for Transport's list of kind of high cost benefit value investments to make. Just to touch on some of the others, I think things like weaker wage growth, I think people aren't very good at understanding the counterfactual world that they didn't see. So maybe there'll be slightly background sort of discontent with not feeling like they're getting that much better off, but I think they probably won't really realise the sort of what could have happened. On risks, I suppose on the NHS one, the real risk is, will the money going in the next couple of years really be enough to turn things around and then be able to somewhat slow down NHS spending growth beyond that to try and make space for the other things? Clearly got a big challenge ahead of them. I think as the big risk is if productivity growth doesn't start to pick up at some point, then we all face much bigger problems.
Great, thank you. Let's see what you all thought. Lots of votes for the NHS. It's certainly absorbing. We can't see weaker wage growth at the bottom. But, too many options. We've broken the poll. That definitely does not add up to 100%.
I wanted another one.
So the NHS is definitely absorbing, as we say, a lot of the spending over the next 2 years. Goodness knows it needs it. And yes, I think definitely the government is definitely banking on the fact that in the short run, punters will forgive them for a bit less wage growth in return for a bit more public services. That definitely feels like the political gamble of this budget. Great, I think with that we'll end it here, so you can get on to whatever you have planned for the rest of your day. Let's just end with a quick thank you to our panellists.